into. Essentially, these are people who haven't typically been involved in the political process. On Bernie's case, it's the young people. In Donald Trump's case, it is made up of the independents and the libertarians who haven't been participating. You have to realize that in the United States, only 40 to 45% of the electorate turns out for elections. That other 60 to 55% are people that have not any reason to, or are angry enough and dissatisfied enough or frustrated enough that they haven't participated in the process.
Okay, but the fact that Bernie's attracting young people, isn't that a good thing?
It's all very good. I think what Trump and Sanders are doing is extremely good. I think we want full participation. In Denmark, for example, 90% of the people participate in every election. Why don't we have that here? We should be running a national lottery to run it off of the voting ballots and give people, a few winners $100 million or something to get them to come out. We can't get more than 40% of the electorate to come out to the elections. In New Hampshire, we'll get 60%, so we're dealing with a smaller number. But those are people that are now engaged because of Donald Trump, because of Bernie Sanders. They're angry, they're frustrated, and in the case of the young people, they also don't understand all the things that Bernie is talking about are going to cost them a considerable pretty penny over the course of their lives. In Denmark, they have social welfare. They have single-payer healthcare systems. I used it. It's not a bad program. It's not as good as some of the healthcare that we have in the United States, but everybody does have it. But the problem is that Danes pay 60 to 75% of their income for those services.
Okay, but to be fair, Canadians don't. Canadians pay, not ordinary working Canadians pay about anywhere from 31 to 33%, which is about the same as Americans do. And so there's a much bigger social safety net in Denmark. But when you look at if you just had Medicare for all and compare it to the Canadian system, there's no reason to think it's going to be so expensive.
No, and the reason that it is so expensive in this country is not because it's not a single payer system, it's because the docs, the hospitals, and the pharmaceuticals are all gaming the system, and they're charging way more for their services and for their products than what they should be. And that's where the cost can be brought down, and that can be brought down in a single payer system, one would think, although in this country, unlike Canada and Denmark, the typical American doesn't believe and doesn't have faith that government can actually enact these kinds of programs and do it well.
Well, again, polling showing majority of people actually support, when they were polling even in 2012, majority of people supported a single system.
In the United States?
In the United States. Oh, yeah.
Whose poll are you looking at?
All it.
We can argue this point.
Polling.
We can argue this point.
Well, certainly within the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, a majority of people support it.
Right, and the problem is that in the long run, where those costs have to come down is not due to single payer system. It's due to better management of how that care is provided. And that's either in the cost of pharmaceutical goods, that's in the care, the cost of the hospital care,
but the
and
single
that's in
payer
the
system
cost of the doctors. So it's not directed to. If you look at Germany, for example, they don't have a single payer system. They have a system that has both government and private sector implementation. In Germany, they have better services and equal costs to what Canada and what Denmark offers. So I would venture to say that you could have a combination of the two, and you could do a better job still than what Canada and Denmark are providing.
Perhaps, but just again, in terms of the Canadian system.
That's the discussion that we have to
But this
get
is
into.
not. But I'm
if
saying.
you listen to Bernie Sanders, he's offering one solution,
Yeah.
and that's all. And I think that in America, that's not the way to solve the problem.
But to think that young people and other people, I mean, I've been interviewing people who are pro-Sanders
Sure.
who are in their 60s, and there's plenty of older people who have been involved in politics for a long time who are supporting Sanders. So it's not just young people, and many of the young people we've interviewed are actually very sophisticated in their understanding on some of these domestic issues.
They have a deep and long-term understanding of this problem. They've looked at it from the international perspective and all of the different countries that have done these programs.
You can say that about a lot of the people supporting Hillary and not
I'm
either.
sure you've talked to very intelligent people who are well informed about this. This is a very complicated system.
Yeah,
you can't solve it. In particular, you can't solve it from one position that is being driven by an individual who neither works with Democrats, let alone works with Republicans over the entire career of the 24 years that he's been in the Congress. So I've got to say, the person who's going to solve this problem is the person who has demonstrated over her career, and that would be Hillary Clinton, that she has been able to work with both Democrats and Republicans to ferret out the waste and the inefficiencies and to solve the problem in a way that is acceptable to the broad American public.
But there is a fundamental thing that why the Canadian system controls costs far better than the American system, which is private insurance companies are completely out of the equation.
That's part of what, and I didn't mention that, so you're absolutely right.
And number two,
Yep.
actually there's probably three. One, hospitals on the whole are
I mentioned
publicly
that one.
owned.
Yep.
And number three, because it's essentially one single massive buyer of pharmaceuticals, there's enormous leverage in beating
Yes.
down pharmaceutical prices, which is why a shampoo that you could buy here for $230, you can get in Canada for $19.95.
I can sell you a toilet seat for $400 here through the military. That's the problem that has to be taken out of the system, and you're absolutely right.
Right. So
That doesn't get solved by a single payer system. That gets solved by good management and good process evaluation. And I think that can be done I think that can be done more effectively through the private sector than it can from the government sector, and that's why you have to get money out of the political system, because that's influencing the political system way too much as well.
But certainly you will acknowledge that there are people who have studied this for a long time
Yes.
in great detail and have come to the conclusion that a single payer system works very well. I'm not saying all people that have studied it have come to that conclusion, but it's not just some young people that don't know anything.
Any system that is properly applied can work very well. It doesn't necessarily stand to be the case unless and until that appropriate application is put into place.
But I take your point with the German model. There is some evidence that
Yes.
this public-private kind of system can control costs. But in general, most countries have found that if you don't take out the profit motive, it's very difficult to control the costs.
Hillary Clinton tried a single payer system when she first offered her health care program back in the 1990s. I was a supporter of that. I could support a single payer system if it was proven that it would in fact ferret out and rid the system of the waste and inefficiencies that we've been talking about. But to state right from the very beginning that that is the only solution by someone who has proven that he has not worked well with both sides of the parties on either side of the aisle, I think makes it very questionable whether he will be successful.
Well, the Affordable
and
Care
that's
Act
the
was-
leadership that we're looking for, is we want the leadership who can do the work, not talk about the work.
I'm not here to defend or support the Affordable Care Act, but it was passed over the screaming blue murder of Republicans. It was not a great
If
piece
I were
of
president, I
collaboration.
wouldn't have done it that way. I would have made sure that there was Republican acceptance of that program, because that's how you build that consensus, the broad consensus throughout the whole country.
Let's turn to foreign policy. You were an ambassador in
Yes.
Denmark. You have foreign policy concerns, obviously. Just to be clear, your background originally, you were an architect concerned with community development.
Yes.
You met the Clintons here in '91. You
Yes.
helped Bill run his campaigns in New Hampshire. You became friends with the family. You were a congressman.
Yes.
You're saved mostly because of your support for the Brady Bill. You wound up losing in New
Yes.
Hampshire. All correct so far?
So far.
And then you were appointed to become ambassador to Denmark. I'm just doing this by way of background.
Sure.
So you're not a foreign policy specialist, but you're an ambassador, so it's fair game, yeah?
Well, and I've lived overseas not only as an ambassador, but I've worked all around the world on projects and development projects in countries like Turkey and in Africa and Indonesia. So I've had a lot of experience overseas, yes.
Okay. So obviously, when Hillary Clinton points to her experience and her record, I'm ready to hit the ground running. And the response from Bernie Sanders has been, and from others, but that experience has not always shown good judgment. And of course, the vote for the Iraq War is the most glaring example, they say. And Bernie Sanders says, we had access to the same information. And in fact, Barack Obama came to the same conclusion, that this war was not a good war. I mean, in Barack Obama's position, it was a stupid war and would create a terrible situation. Bernie Sanders was against it, I think, perhaps for even more broad reasons. But at any rate, how does one get past that? Because is it not an expression of a whole worldview?
It's very simple. First of all, you're picking one vote of Clinton's that you're trying to hold out as the major flaw in a Clinton candidacy. Well, let's pick out a single vote in a Sanders history and make that the single flaw of his ability to go forward as a leader. And you can pick on his stand in favor of no gun control. You can pick on the fact that he has not worked with Republicans or Democrats on numerous other pieces
Well,
of
actually,
legislation.
that's not true. On the veterans
So
legislation, he did.
Well, that is one example out of hundreds when he didn't.
But
so
if
what
you
you're
reduce
doing
this
is you're
argument-
making a very narrow argument about one particular issue that, yes, you may disagree
There's never
or
an
Sanders
examination
may-
of anyone's record,
Well,
because it's just a mistake, and everyone makes mistakes.
that's correct, but more importantly,
How do you
it's
run on a record? Why run on your record?
because you have so many other things that you've done that are so much more
Well, let's talk about
impressive.
some of the
Sure.
other things. So, well, first of all, let's get the gravity of
Sure.
the Iraq War. Millions of people in the streets against it in 2003. 20 million people demonstrate around the world. Experts at the level of even foreign policy people for Bush 1 coming out against the war. Retired military leaders coming out against the war. Expert after expert in the region that say this is crazy, this cannot end well. The way the Iraq War wound up destabilizing the region. And in fact, if you're concerned about Iranian influence, as Secretary Clinton says she is, clearly the overthrow of Saddam led to increasing Iranian influence, and that was predicted at the time. We were covering this story then.
I think
so. This
that
is
the
not just like
Secretary
a mistake.
has already made a statement about what she believes was the conditions for the vote, and that she now admits that that was a mistake. So I don't know if it makes much sense to sort of beat this dead horse, as it were.
Well, because of the gravity of the vote. But let's go on to something more current. The U.S. policy, which she helped shape in Libya.
Yes.
There's a UN resolution which calls for the defense of Benghazi. Leaders, including Cameron from the UK, President Obama, and others, all said at the time, this is not about regime change. This is about defense of Benghazi. It clearly became very early on about regime change and the overthrow of Gaddafi. Many legal experts have said it's actually illegal because it went way past the United Nations resolution and has led to the complete destruction of the country, a chaos, a new base for terrorism. I mean, all the things that was supposedly we weren't going to do again has been done in Libya. Isn't this another case of bad judgment?
And what you're telling me is that the Secretary of State has the authority to supersede the president.
I
and
do not.
be
I
the
think
director
he's
of that foreign
as culpable.
policy.
No, he's more culpable. He's the president.
That's
but
right.
she certainly helped shape it and did not. There is. I have never heard a word, unless you have, where she has ever distanced herself from that. As far as I know, she was fully involved.
Her involvement in the foreign policy was obviously to stabilize and to participate in the Arab Spring in a way that was ultimately going to open up and make more broadly accessible the leaders of democracy in these Arab countries. It has been a much more difficult row to hoe than what we initially, I think we as the United States initially thought would be the case. I'm not sure that I understand your question because...
We're talking about judgment here.
Well, I think that, what do you think would have happened had the administration not done what it did? Are you telling me that it would be better off? Are you telling me that you have a special clairvoyant connection into what the future might have been had different choices been made? Because I don't think that it would have been much better of a situation either way you look at it.
Well, you're the one doing the crystal ball. I'm just saying
No,
there was a United
you're
Nations.
the one. You're the one that's saying that
No, I'm
she
saying-
made the decision and that the decision was wrong. That's implying that there was a right decision.
Not just wrong. I said it was illegal.
No, I don't think there's
my point, it
anything
was
illegal.
illegal.
What is illegal about
There was a
this?
UN resolution which called for the defense of Benghazi and actually specifically said it shouldn't go further than the defense of Benghazi. And the leaders at the time when they were selling the resolution said this is not about regime change.
So who is prosecuting that illegality? I don't know
Well,
that.
who's prosecuting the illegality of the Iraq War, which the
But who-
Secretary
okay, so-
General of the
so-
United Nations said was illegal.
But so
That's a
you
different
are
issue.
you are the person who is determining that these things are illegal?
No. There's of course not. If you want to take the Iraq War, Secretary General of the United Nations said it was illegal because there was no
But has
enabling
it been
legislation.
proven so? I mean, I can.
no,
shall I make charges against you that you know?
Well, you're welcome to.
But I think that's what
I
you're
didn't
doing. Is
invade
you're
anybody.
making charges that are pulled out of thin air.
Just, you don't think that the UN? Do you think that the United Nations authorized the invasion of Iraq?
The United Nations did not authorize the invasion of Iraq. That was done by the president in conjunction with the Congress. That we went back, we discussed the vote that Hillary already had cast as a senator that was part of what provided the authorization for the president to,
But
to
under
make that
international
decision.
law, the United Nations authorization was required.
I don't agree with you.
Don't.
No.
Well, do we subscribe to the UN Charter or not? You cannot invade another country unless you're under imminent danger of attack.
That's
and
what I
clearly there was
believe.
no imminent danger.
Well, I guess that's a difference of opinion.
Well, there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and frankly, even if there were, there was no danger that there was no evidence that those.
No evidence of weapons of mass destruction didn't appear until we had already invaded and discovered that there were no weapons of mass
Oh,
destruction.
Hans Blix was saying before the invasion, we can't find anything. He's quoted Hans Blix, the inspector for the United Nations, saying over and over again, if you know where they are, you tell us and we'll go look. And then they kept telling him and they would go, and there wasn't anything. I mean, Blix was saying over and over again that there is nothing here. This was not a mystery. And we know now how cooked the evidence was. So it's not just something we found afterwards. We know how much Bush Cheney
Well,
cooked
we
the evidence.
confirmed afterwards. I think that there were differences of opinion, and obviously
Well,
the
let me
evidence
go to
was
another
not
one.
strong enough. I mean, why would there have been an overwhelming support in the U.S. Congress if the evidence was so compelling as you state?
Well, there wasn't. Well, first
It
of all,
wasn't.
there was
It
there was
wasn't.
an
I'm sorry.
overwhelming support.
Look, my
for-
first vote as a
Yeah.
member of Congress was
Yeah.
in favor of the first Persian Gulf War. I had nothing to do with the second Iraq War. But the fact of the matter is that when you're dealing with these kinds of situations, the fact that an investigator from the United Nations has one opinion that he states, or that someone says something from some other position of authority, that's not a guarantee that that condition is exactly as they say.
but Barack
These are
Obama
very
and Bert
difficult.
was
These are
able to make
very
such a
difficult.
judgment.
These are very difficult situations, and Barack Obama had a point of view, and Bernie Sanders had a point of view, Hillary Clinton had a point of view, and others had points of view. All I'm saying is that if you put yourself in that position, I'm sure that you would understand more clearly how difficult these decisions are, and that different people will have different conclusions.
And when
about
you're
the
voting, and when you're
information that
deciding
they
who
have.
president is, you decide who actually exercised judgment in these critical
Mm-hmm.
moments, and what one thinks is the most reasonable way, and that's the point they're making.
Well, and I think that ultimately that is an important part of one's resume, if you will, for running for the leader of the nation.
Let me give you another example.
Okay?
I'm not sure you're familiar with it, and I don't say that in any critical way. A lot of people kind of miss this. There's a very important vote in 2007. The Republicans put forward a motion to declare the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as terrorists. Do you remember this vote?
I think I do.
Almost the entire leadership of the Democratic Party, foreign policy experts, including at the time Obama, Senator Obama, Webb, others, Biden, everyone was against this resolution. Webb actually led the charge on it, but there were others. And the argument they gave is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is actually part of the Iranian armed forces. And if you want to call them terrorists, then you're essentially saying the Iranian state is terrorist, and you want to declare them as terrorists, which means you preclude any kind of negotiations. You could never negotiate with such a state, declaring that state terrorist. There's only one leading Democrat that's voted in favor of that Republican motion, and that was Senator Clinton. Now that motion would have killed the possibilities of what later became a deal with Iran, which now she's partly taking credit for. What I'm getting at, this is part of her worldview. This is why, you've heard it, she's considered very hawkish.
And I guess the question that I ask you is, in order for the United States to remain an important and powerful leader in the world, to keep at bay many of the problems that have sprung up, I think there needs to be a strong leadership that may have, as you call, elements of hawkishness that have to be employed. I think that Hillary Clinton has made judgments over the broad career that have led to or would lead to retaining the United States as a strong leader in the world, and would help in retaining the peace that we are always trying to retain globally. So from that perspective, I don't see that these are the kinds of issues and the kinds of conflicts that you're trying to present in a contrast with Bernie Sanders. I think with a Sanders presidency, the United States would be a much weaker leader worldwide, and that there would be more problems like what we're seeing today, and that would be, I think, a very unfortunate situation.
Okay, let's move shortly, because we're running a little out of time, but we'll move to another topic. It's a little more it's also in your wheelhouse. How's that? How do you compare Sanders and Clinton on climate change? You've been involved in developing climate change policy. You've been involved in renewable energy. Mm-hmm. I was actually kind of surprised by both Sanders and Clinton in the last debate, how little they talked about climate change. It was like,
it's kind of
I'm
an
sorry,
assumed
not the last
topic
debate,
that
the
both
one
of them
before.
would cover without any question.
Well, if the science is right,
I mean, abortion was not talked about in any of the debates either. I mean, the issues that are very much in the wheelhouse of the Democrats tend not to be discussed at the Democratic debates. You or I may not agree that that should be the case, but that's what had happened. So,
well, scientists are telling us, and both candidates seem to agree with it,
yes,
that this is the greatest challenge of our time, the greatest threat of our time.
No, Bernie says it's the greatest threat. I think Hillary says that terrorism is an important threat that we need to deal with.
What do you say?
I think that probably the social unrest around the globe is the greatest problem, and that the climate change issue is second to that.
Really?
Why are you surprised?
I'm surprised because you're into climate policy, energy, and I am no expert on this, so no. But if you look at the reports from the United Nations climate experts, mm-hmm. and you look at their predictions of what happens if significant changes aren't made in keeping fossil fuels in the ground and developing sustainable energy, we're talking about apocalyptic predictions. And I don't understand how
but if you understand really how you can solve the climate problem, then you don't set that as such a priority. And the solution is this. We waste so much. We use the wrong fuels. We waste so much of the materials and resources that we extract from this planet. And we do not develop new communities with the intention or the idea that those new markets will be, if not zero carbon communities, they will be very minimal contributors to the pollution. And if we did not do that, if we used our resources efficiently, if we created all the new jobs that would have a positive impact on the environment, and I believe that there is so much that can be done with regard to improving the environment that doesn't cost you or me more money out of our wallets, but it is actually just better systems, better technology that is used more broadly, we would solve that problem and provide jobs which would address the problems of social unrest, which is why we have so much conflict around the world. These things go hand in hand. They're not one is more important than the other. They have to be solved in unison. But they have at their roots economic solutions that are going to actually make these differences. And they are not going to be solved with military force. They're not going to be solved with wrapping our arms around a tree and hugging that tree at whatever cost, no matter who has to bear the expense. And that's what's wrong with our leaders today, is we do not have holistic generalists who have the ability to see across the horizon. As an architect, I have to learn how to see everything all at once. You can't build a house without understanding where the foundation goes, the first, second, third floor, and the roofs. With regard to solving these problems, you have to understand how the economic prosperity of the community needs to be protected as you also protect the environment.
Okay, well,
These things can be done in conjunction. So I think both candidates could learn from that example.
well, one of the debates that's taking place about all of this is taking place in Canada about what to do with the Athabasca tar sands. And it very much influences what's happening in the United States because the Koch brothers, who are funding a lot of the politics that's essentially denying there is a problem with climate change and or trying to slow down legislation that might reduce the use of fossil fuels, a lot of the Koch brothers' fortune, or in fact the majority, has been made in Canada in the Athabasca tar sands. A journalist in Canada, and I'm kind of winding up here, I'm throwing something.
I understand.
Bruce Livesey is a journalist in Canada who made a documentary for Global Television, one of the larger Canadian TV networks, about the Koch brothers in Canada and the influence they have there and why they want the XL pipeline to take Canadian tar sand oil down to their refineries in the Gulf. And that film, after being finished, was never shown. And in fact, Bruce was fired by Global Television. The film was buried. And a lot of people think this is the film the Koch brothers didn't want you to see. We can't prove there was a direct connection between the Koch brothers and Global Television's canceling the film, but some people are suggesting so. So we are going to try to finish making that film. And right now we have a little promo from Bruce explaining what the film was about. And here's the clip. We're having some reason playing the Koch brothers clip, the film, so we'll get that ready in just a moment. Before we go to something else, let me first of all do something I should have done before throwing to the Koch brothers clip, which is thank Richard Sweat for joining us and participating. I hope was a lively conversation.
It was a great debate. Thank you. I enjoyed
Thank
it
you very much.
Yeah.
And now we are going to go to Jessica did some interviews in the field with some Bernie Sanders supporters. And we'll come back after that, and pretty soon we'll show you the clip about the soon-to-be-made but buried Koch brothers film. But now first, Jessica out in the field.
So we're continuing our coverage outside the Palace Theater, where Bernie Sanders was talking to a group of New Hampshireites about why they should vote for him tomorrow. So I'm joined now by Megan, who is a Bernie Sanders supporter. Thanks for being with us, Megan.
Thank you.
So, Megan, why are you supporting Bernie Sanders? What in particular, policy-wise? Let's talk specifics that you like about him.
I really am supportive of his policies as far as education goes. Being a college graduate myself and $60,000 in debt for the rest of, forever. Somebody inside just said she has $160,000 in debt. Dentists go up to $400,000. That's a little ridiculous. I'm all for public education all the way up through the university level being free. I'm not really supportive of private education in the first place, but especially in universities' cases.
Did you ever look at Hillary Clinton as a possible vote for her?
For a while, and then I did some digging into as far as where her money is coming from and what she supports specifically. That's a thing we do in New Hampshire, sort of nitpick, and I'm really not impressed.
What specifically were you not impressed with?
Time Warner gives her an awful lot of money. I'm not about that life.
You were not comfortable with a media mogul?
Especially not Time Warner.
Okay, and what about her $12 minimum wage? Do you feel like that's enough?
The minimum wage should be, Bernie pointed out earlier, that 50 years ago, a person working minimum federal wage could support a family of four. You're not going to be, I can't live on $12, and that's just me between bills and rent and college loans.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
No, it's not happening.
Gotcha. Okay, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Hillary potentially being the first female president. So did that at least interest you in terms of thinking about her as a potential candidate that you'd support?
Before Bernie announced that he was running for president, she would have been my vote. Partially because she's a woman, but again, after I started to do some digging about 9 months ago when he announced his candidacy, I was like, I'm really not sure I can support this. And the idea that being a woman, I have to vote for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman is frankly asinine. I'm not really.
So you did not appreciate Gloria Steinem's comments about the girls following the boys to Bernie.
Oh, Gloria Steinem needs to be quiet sometimes. Just, this is what you're doing. This is what you need to be doing.
Yeah, earlier you said you had an eye roll that.
Oh, is the earth tilting off its axis with how hard I'm rolling my eyes? I can't.
Okay, Megan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, and thank you for watching us on The Real News. Back to you, Paul, in the studio.
Well, we're back at Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm putting my earpiece back in. We are now going to talk to a senior foreign policy advisor. Yes, a senior policy advisor for Donald Trump, and mostly on foreign policy. He was, before this, he was a policy advisor for Jeff Sessions, who is a senator from Alabama, right? Am I right about that?
Yes, Alabama.
Thank you. And he joins us here in the studio. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Although this interview doesn't get too off track, I do want to mention that my specialty is trade and immigration policy, less so than foreign policy, although I will do my best to answer any foreign policy questions you have.
Okay, well, we could start with...
I like to think that I'll be able to talk about foreign policy as well, so happy to do that too.
Okay, so Donald, let's start with foreign policy, then we'll move into, I guess, the immigration policy is probably the most controversial. Donald Trump has sort of, I would call, eclectic positions, at least in relation to some of the other Republicans. Maybe Ted Cruz a little bit too. Donald Trump was against the Iraq War, correct?
Yes.
Why?
I think that he foresaw what others did, both certain segments of the left and certain segments of the right, that it would become extremely expensive in terms of blood and treasure, that the nation-building experiment wasn't going to be successful, and that ultimately it wouldn't enhance our national security interests, which is not to take anything away from the extraordinary sacrifice of the men and women who served there and are still sacrificing both in Iraq and in other theaters all across the Middle East, as well as the enormous monstrosity of Saddam Hussein. But as a national security question, I think he foresaw what we've seen play out, which is that it did not advance our national security interests, and if anything, it ended up creating a space destabilization where new terror threats could emerge.
And do you think in an election, if there was an election, which was Trump versus Clinton, how much do you think her vote for the Iraq War might help him?
I think it would actually help him immensely. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about what that general election matchup would look like. Again, we don't know who's going to win the Democrat nomination, but let's just assume that it will be Hillary for the sake of this. There's a couple issues where we're scrambling the political consensus.